everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ipsita. I'm the National Training Coordinator with the ACT Consortium, and I'm so happy you can join us for our September webinar entitled Clinical Trials Across the Lifespan, Considerations for Trials with Pregnant People and Children. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Lauren Kelly and Dr. Natalie Dayan with our clinical trials training platform, Impact. Today's talk will be about 45 minutes and it will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. So please drop your questions into the Q&A box throughout the presentation and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Please note that today's talk will be recorded. A little bit about the ACT Consortium. So the Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium was funded by CIHR in 2022 through the Clinical Trials Fund, and it was established to facilitate, optimize, and accelerate the conduct, implementation, and results translation from high-quality, high-impact, randomized controlled trials to improve health in Canada and around the world. ACT's governance model is composed of 23 committees and working groups, and today's webinar is brought to you by ACT's Training Committee. The ACT Coordination Centre is located at the Population Health Research Institute in Hamilton, Ontario, and as such, we recognize and acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. This agreement was created to bind the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the Great Law of Peace. The dish represents the shared land, while One Spoon reinforces the idea of sharing and peace. We hope to bring a similar spirit of collaboration to the work being done by the Canada-wide members of the ACT Consortium. And with that, I'll pass it over to one of the co-chairs of our training committee, Dr. Jean Bourbeau, to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you very much, Ipsita. Thanks to the training committee and to ACT. And I'd really like to give a special thanks to the two presenters, Lauren Kelly and Natalie Dayan, okay, and to the CTTP Impact, okay, here, okay, which is really offering to do this presentation. It cannot be a better time than the PREG trial, okay, just received a CIHR, okay, and being funded, okay, by CIHR. And I'm sure Natalie can explain more about that. Lauren Kelly is the early career researcher, associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology Therapeutic at the University of Manitoba. She's a certified clinical researcher professional and serves as the clinical trial director for the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. She is the principal investigator for 3 pediatric clinical trials, has authored over 50 publication and hold the more than 7 million in funding from a variety of public agencies, including CIHR funded clinical trial training platform Impact. Natalie Dayan is an associate professor at McGill, my institution, director of the Obstetric Journal Internal Medicine Program at McGill University Health Center and scientist at the Research Institute of the MUHC. She holds a career award from the Fondation, la Fondation de Recherche en Santé, Québec, and held an early career professorship in Women, Heart, and Brain health from the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Quebec at McGill. She has current and past operating funds from CIHR Maternal Health Research, including for the project PREG trial, which she will discuss today. Then welcome to our two speakers, and thanks to Impact CTTP.
Excellent. Thanks, Ipsita, and thanks, John, for the warm introduction to our topic today. So I just wanted to start, and on a national level at Impact, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples on the lands in which they live, work, and visit, and become engaged allies together. And we as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, language, and the pursuit of wellness. So I just wanted to start this morning by acknowledging that I'm calling in today from Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg, which are the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I just start by acknowledging the land as a way to remind everyone, and I hope that you all agree to take, a bit more responsibility in looking at how we conduct our research and our clinical trials in a way that is more inclusive, and thinking about whose data is not represented in the care that they currently receive. And so a few quick disclosures for myself. I'm not going to read through all of these. Essentially, both of us hold a variety of public funding, and none of these conflicts are relevant to the conversation that we're going to have today. Our objectives for today are listed on the screen here. We really want to talk about why more clinical trials should take a more inclusive approach, including different ages and as well as people who are pregnant. We're going to start by talking a bit about the pediatric population, and then I'll turn it over about halfway to Dr. Dayan, who will focus on inclusion of pregnant people. And at the end of the talk today, we do hope to have a bit of discussion with you all about what supports are needed from groups like Impact and Preg Trial to help you design trials that are more inclusive across the lifespan. So why are we here today? Well, anyone who works in the space of caring for pregnant people or children will know that much of the data that guides their care has been generated in non-pregnant, non-pediatric populations. And this means that lots of practice guidelines and care that is received is not generally informed by data gathered in those populations. And if we look here in Canada, and we're talking about a lifespan approach to trials today, and acknowledging that includes also the older adult age groups, that won't be a focus of today. But you can see here in Canada, there's quite a large number of clinical trials that have sites, and less so in the pediatric space, and even less so when we look at indications in pregnancy. And if we were all in one room today, this would be where I ask you to raise your hand if you were ever a child that resulted from a pregnancy. And I think you would all, put your hands up in the air. And so clearly this is a gap here in Canada where we need to build more capacity and also some more awareness around the importance of including these populations. And so the problem is that many treatments are off-label in children and in pregnancy. 91% of drugs don't have insufficient data on use in pregnancy. Up to 75% of drugs are used off-label in children, meaning that, there is no data in that group that has been submitted for a label change. And up to 70% of people are taking at least one prescription medication. Chronic illnesses don't stop when you become pregnant. I'm sure this is not a surprise to most of you on the call today. Yet we still lack incentives here in Canada for companies and investigators and scientists and research teams to actually develop drugs and study drugs for perinatal and pediatric indications. And our healthcare systems are bursting at the seams. There's lots of, everywhere is overworked and lots to do, but there's not a lot of people who are trained in actually how to design trials, how to run trials with these populations. There's not a lot of funding for investigators to lead this work, and not a lot of infrastructure or really protected time to really focus on including these populations in clinical trials. And so before I turn it over to Natalie to talk specifically about some pregnancy considerations, I thought I'd talk a little bit about clinical trials with children, how Canada kind of plays into the international space, and a bit about what we can learn from some other jurisdictions. So studying children and the need to include children is not new. The NIH adopted their policy of inclusion back in 1998. Both the FDA and the European Medicines Agency have mandated pediatric drug plans, meaning if you are making a new medicine that will be used in children, you need a plan for how you will study it in children. These have been in place since 2002 and 2004. So the lifespan policy currently, NIH does have a lifespan policy. It was created in 2017, and it impacts all research funded since 2019. So if you were getting a clinical trial funded in the US, you have to justify your age inclusion. It does not specifically, though, include pregnancy or lactation. I think that's a bit of a gap. So in the US, they have groups that assess these things and say basically if this inclusion or exclusion of the pediatric age group is appropriate. They have peer review guidance and a bunch of flow charts to sort of help reviewers make those decisions. But they also have a different system in the US where they must report age stratified data. So they have to tell the funders, how they did in terms of meeting those pediatric recruitment goals. And I think that that's something, really we could really learn from here in Canada. And so if you look at the policy, none of these are reasons why, these are very kind of self-explanatory reasons. If this is a disease that does not occur in children, something like Alzheimer's disease, then it would be relevant not to include them. if, the data is already available, if there is a reason to have a specific pediatric study, if there is not enough, if you're doing a longitudinal study and kids weren't recruited then, so you can't add them now. I mean, there are rational reasons not to have pediatric populations in your study, but there's also a lot of really good reasons to think about including them. And so I would imagine that some of the lifespan policy work in Canada will be based off of the American models. So here in Canada, we do not have a pediatric drug rule yet in capital letters. There is currently a voluntary pilot program that Health Canada has been offering. It's ongoing now. I think it started in April, and it will ongo for 2 years before it rolls into legislation. They did also create, Health Canada created a national priority list of pediatric drugs that we know we need data, we need to bring these drugs to Canada, and it's not quite clear how those medicines will come in, whether that's through more clinical trials or otherwise. And recently, CIHR committed in their action plan to developing a lifespan approach to research here in Canada. And so you may be hearing about a lifespan approach for the first time from us today, but I'm sure you'll be hearing about it with lots more discussions happening in the Canadian landscape. And so just as a way of letting you know, you can access anything about the pediatric drug development plans on the Health Canada website. And there's not a lot available about the lifespan approach at CIHR, but it is stated as one of their EDI actions with a timeline to be determined. So hopefully that will roll out in the next few years. And one thing to think about, and we'll talk about some considerations for these populations at the end, but children are not small adults. Their diseases are, have different etiologies, they have different prognosis. They have different tools that are available and validated to measure outcomes. And so it's really important that if you're designing a population across multiple age groups, you have investigators on your team who have some experience in pediatric research and in recruitments and modeling. And just a quick example on the next slide that shows in one of our trials where we actually have both adult and pediatric populations. What we did is look at how these diseases affect the populations differently, what we expect to be different, and use that to calculate our sample size. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this trial or the details, but you can see just the blue lines in our pediatric patients. The orange lines are adult patients. You can see we need far fewer. This is the number of people needed in our study. You can see we actually need far fewer pediatric patients with a high degree of power to answer our research question in both our control arms than we do adult patients. And that's because we actually expect the children to respond to this intervention with a more profound effect. And so where do you get help? So if you're thinking about a clinical trial and involving pediatric populations, there are some additional things to think about. So the IMPACT, and John mentioned IMPACT is one of the clinical trial training platforms that was also funded when ACT was funded in the clinical trial fund. And so IMPACT is really 3 things. So the first being open and accessible online learning, the second being immersive fellowships to turn ideas into trial grants. And this is really meant at supporting investigator-initiated trials and a cross-sectoral summit. And so our first course is actually live. It just launched yesterday, and this is an introduction to clinical trials course. It looks at regulations and the landscape here in Canada, ethics and equity and safety considerations. Anyone can make an account. These are free courses. You just have to go to this link, myrise.lms.ca, and you can make a free account to access the courses. And also on our on YouTube, as well as on Rise, you can find our past webinars. And thanks a lot to IPSITA and to ACT who have been sharing about these webinars. I'm sure hopefully you will continue to get notified through the ACT training platform about some of these opportunities. And so IMPACT is, more than 90 mentors. We have 14 parent and youth mentors, 5 courses that are in development. Again, the first one launching, and we had 18 fellows start in the program last year. And the vision is simple. It's really to create capacity in perinatal and child health, to create a common space for training and mentorship, to harness the strengths of these teams that we have here in Canada with sustainable and accessible training infrastructure. And so, as I mentioned, we have 14 youth and parent and mentors, and they play a strong role. Each of our trainees is assigned to a youth or a parent, depending on what kind of trial they're designing, to help support them throughout their journey. And a big, huge thanks to all of our many partner organizations. One last thing before I turn it over to Natalie is just that our awards are open right now. So if you have an idea about developing a trial, either with a pediatric population or with a pregnant population, We actually have training awards that are open now until October for our cohort that will start next April. We do have dedicated funding for Black and Indigenous applicants, and you do not need to have a protected amount of time or matching funds. And it's really fun. We did an elevator pitch this year. And so these are all the different trials that our current impact fellows are designing. And you can see there's a huge variety of interventions that are going to be included in these trials. So it's been really exciting to welcome our first cohort and look forward to our next cohort. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie to talk a bit more about the landscape of trials in pregnancy. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that great overview of trials in pediatrics and for your work in impact. It's really phenomenal. And also thank you to Jean for inviting me and Lauren here to speak today. And congratulations on CAN, TRAIN, and ACT. This is a very exciting time for clinical trials. So talking about clinical trials in pregnant people, I think it's important to take a moment. Lauren spoke a little bit about some of the issues in children. They're a little bit different, although there's some commonalities in pregnancy. And so how did we get here? There's a bit of a historical context. Many of you may be familiar with thalidomide. Thalidomide in the 1950s and 60s was a drug used to treat nausea in pregnancy. And after some experience with that drug, there were thousands of children that were found to have birth defects from the use of this drug. And so, of course, this was a tragedy, but it also, resulted in some, the scientific community learned from this by improving toxicity testing. So after, this crisis, there was, more systematic toxicity testing, which, really was an advantage that we saw from this tragedy. But it did cause some fear of prescribing and testing of novel drugs in pregnancy. And it resulted in the label of pregnant people as a vulnerable group, which is understandable given, the risks and concerns, but also, is a bit of a double-edged sword, which you'll see. And this led in the 1970s to FDA classification. You may be familiar with the former classification of drugs for use in pregnancy as class A, B, C, D, and X. Which has now fallen out of favor because it provides the erroneous impression that that drugs are really kind of either safe or harmful, and there's a lot more context to a discussion about the use of a drug in pregnancy, such as how severe the woman's disease is, what other options there are, what does the data show? Is there registry level data to support the use of this drug? And so, I think right now it's not really useful, but this was a reaction or a response in a way to the thalidomide crisis. And now what we tend to do in the clinic is really have a discussion with the patients of the balance of the risks and benefits of continuing a drug or having uncontrolled disease. And now we're moving more towards an advocacy for inclusion. So that's really where we're at kind of as a scientific community. The FDA and the National Academy of Sciences in the US developed a working group on some concepts that we should be thinking about for inclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials. And in Canada in 2013, there was a Tri-Council policy statement which did promote inclusion, although it really hasn't been implemented yet. Next slide. So what are some of the maternal factors that influence medication use and outcomes in pregnancy? I guess you can advance. So some maternal factors would be, we have seen, and Lauren touched on this before, that chronic diseases don't go away when people get pregnant. And in fact, over time, we've seen an increase in obesity and a lot of obesity-related chronic health conditions and also age-related chronic health conditions in women entering pregnancy. And so these are quite common in individuals entering pregnancy. And we know that the control of these conditions has a huge, it hugely influences their outcomes in pregnancy. There are also some infectious diseases, notably Zika virus, which disproportionately affect pregnant individuals and their offspring. And as Lauren already mentioned, almost 3/4 of people entering pregnancy take at least one prescription medication, and this is without high quality evidence for their effectiveness. And so there are some consequences. One is that we're using this medication, go back, thank you, that we're using this medication without high quality evidence. So in fact, the risk, instead of being undertaken by Health Canada and trialists, the risk is being undertaken by the patient and the provider, because these medications are still being used. We just don't have the evidence for them. And also, as a result of fear, there's under or mistreatment of a lot of these chronic diseases during pregnancy. This results in disease flare, poor outcomes for babies and moms, risk of death, for example, in some situations like asthma or epilepsy that's undertreated, and there's no access to evidence-based care during reproductive years, let alone pregnancy itself, because of this sort of fear of women becoming pregnant on a given medication. And people forget to talk about breastfeeding, but that's another stage of reproduction or a lifespan stage that we have to really account for, that follows pregnancy, obviously. And if a drug is withheld for a chronic disease during all of pregnancy and then all of breastfeeding, you can imagine that often is at least it could be up to 2 years, and then a person becomes pregnant again. So chronic diseases could be untreated for a long time if medications are withheld for these reproductive periods. And this is despite the fact that we know that most drugs enter breast milk in really small quantities. So while this is not true for all medications, the vast majority of medications really don't pass into breast milk that much. That being said, there's a lack of pharmacokinetic studies and trials that include people who are lactating. And as a result, there's either premature breastfeeding continuation, which we know is recommended for infants up to 6 months, or inappropriate cessation of beneficial medications during lactation when, in fact, they could be continued. Now, of course, there are situations in which we would advise a woman to stop breastfeeding so that she can take a necessary drug, but in many cases, there is simply premature breastfeeding discontinuation. So I wanted to give some examples of both non-communicable diseases and then communicable diseases. And so many of you may be familiar with some of the novel diabetes medications in the general population. And of course, these medications, so for example, GLP-1 agonists, SGLT2 inhibitors, have been shown to have vast cardiovascular benefits and metabolic benefits in the general population. It hasn't been studied in reproductive age individuals, so it will be a long time before we really know if people who are planning pregnancy, who are breastfeeding, or who are pregnant can be exposed to these medications. But even before talking about these novel diabetes drugs, metformin, which is an old effective medication for diabetes, has been shown to be safe in pregnancy for more than 20 years. So there was observational meta-analysis showing safety in 2003, a clinical trial for gestational diabetes in 2008, and a clinical trial for type 2 diabetes in pregnancy in 2020. All of these showing some effectiveness in reducing insulin, reducing gestational weight gain, and no apparent harm to babies. There's also been post-marketing surveillance study of kids. So just to show you that there's an abundance of data, but it's still not present in the guidelines as an option to continue throughout pregnancy. Advance the slide. And this is the ethical issue here, is that there's so much fear that effective treatments are simply withheld from pregnant and reproductive age females. And this is not equitable. So pregnant patients are on insulin only typically during their pregnancy. A communicable disease example that is recent, of course, is COVID-19. As the pandemic progressed past a few months, it was quickly noted that pregnant patients were actually at increased risk of severe COVID-19 disease, being in the ICU, preterm birth, and severe maternal morbidity. However, of more than 2,000 COVID-19 therapeutic clinical trials back in 2020, only 1,200 were enrolling persons of reproductive age, and 65% actually systematically excluded pregnant people. And it was an exclusion criteria for those examining Plaquenil or antiviral agents and convalescent plasma studies, despite the fact that these are actually known to be safe for use in pregnancy. Advanced slide. So the ethical issues here were that lack of trials perpetuated the risk of severe disease. And then again, the risk fell on the clinician's shoulders instead of on drug companies. And this also resulted in vaccine hesitancy down the road and delays in pregnant patients receiving the vaccine due to lack of data. So what are some of the barriers to inclusion? The barriers are at the level of drug companies who really simply, want to avoid legal risks. There are delays in study rollout. Again, there's this kind of attribution of pregnant people as a vulnerable group. And because of that, there are additional kind of barriers. At the clinician level, there's really a lack of knowledge or comfort in enrolling pregnant patients in clinical trials. When would they, when wouldn't they? From the researcher level, which applies to you here, there are ethical complexities of inclusion. There are some medication clearly that are teratogenic. There's a lack of resources, tools, and processes. So the fantastic work that CanTrain and Impact is doing hopefully will help to increase the capacity and including in this population. There's also insufficient funding and challenges with enrollment and retention. And that's, based on the fact that clinicians and researchers are not necessarily educating patients, and patients themselves have a fear or misunderstanding about trials in general and about, drugs in pregnancy and lactation. Informed consent, which is a particular issue in both of these populations, pregnancy and children, has often been inadequate. Next slide. So how can we reduce these barriers? So I mentioned previously the FDA and the National Academy of Sciences put out this really fantastic document a couple of years ago outlining some strategies to reduce these barriers. Of course, this is applicable to the US, but I think we can learn from this in the Canadian context as well. So the first is, there are a number of ways that one can reduce regulatory barriers. So for instance, having sort of standardized approaches to Health Canada in which there are, the risk-benefit analysis in a given trial is systematically reviewed, possibly by a body such as PregTrial, which I'll discuss, that can be consulted by trialists across Canada. Enhanced training of researchers and staff about the particularities of drug prescribing in pregnancy. So that includes, understanding the pharmacology of different drugs in pregnancy. That includes understanding different components of informed consent. Having funding for post-marketing surveillance. So often trials are funded for the trial itself, but if a trial includes a pregnant person, then there really should be, some post-marketing surveillance that lasts beyond the usual period, because you would want to see, let's say, if the child is, affected at 1 year or even up to 5 years after exposure to the medication. There needs to be tools to assay drug levels in breast milk. There needs to be innovative study design, so adaptive trial designs, which really was a terrific kind of result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but really a lot of these innovative designs can be used for pregnant patients. Adapt consent processes and tools, and also multinational collaboration. So Lauren touched on the issue of sample size and power. And of course, the same would be true for pregnancy. If they're going to represent just a small sample of a larger clinical trial, it's important to look beyond the given clinical trial and look at who else is studying this and how can we partner to make sure that our outcomes are that there's sort of standardized outcome, core outcome sets that are measured and that can be shared and meta-analyzed at the translation stage. Next slide. So maybe you can click next again. So we all know about, oh, no, go back and forward. Okay, sorry. So we all know about the phases of a clinical trial. Of course, everybody here is familiar. But one innovative study example by Scott Halperin, who's Canadian trialist in biologics and vaccines in pregnancy, has written about the concept of really first testing safety and dose finding in the general population. And once it is deemed safe and there is a safe and effective dose in phase 1, phase 2, that you would then move forward in the general population and then start phase 1 for pregnancy, for example, during the phase 2 or phase 3 for the general population. And this sort of would allow for, accumulation of data in pregnancy, but still have a bit of a safety buffer while not waiting all the way until phase 4 to gather safety in pregnancy data. So there are some considerations for appropriate inclusion in RCT study design. What's important to think about is that it's appropriate inclusion does not mean default inclusion for all. The appropriate inclusion really is, let's consider inclusion of pregnant or lactating people with additional safeguards. So some of the questions we would have to consider when designing trials would be, does this condition substantially affect reproductive age, pregnant or lactating women? Is standard of care during pregnancy for this condition adequate? Does animal data suggest harm or teratogenicity? Is the dose or frequency similar for pregnant women and non-pregnant? Often the answer to that is no. Will this trial alone be able to recruit pregnant or lactating women in sufficient numbers, or do we have to partner again with international collaborators? And is there funding to extend post-marketing surveillance? Even though, we might all be on board that this makes sense, we should be including pregnant patients, we should be including pediatric patients in our clinical trials, there's still going to be a lot of hesitancy, and changing culture really is complicated. It will require us, educating the general public, being able to engage with marginalized populations who would benefit really most, engaging with the scientific community, with policymakers, with industry, and with clinicians. So it really is a multi-pronged approach to changing culture so that we could really get to a point where these populations are included in clinical trials. Next slide. So that brings us to what PregTrial really is. So PregTrial is basically an implementation science type of project which partners with ACT and Impact that was recently funded. And the idea is to be developing working groups centered around non-communicable disease experts and communicable disease experts, in which we will review all of the ethical frameworks that exist, so that we're not reinventing the wheel, and partnering with a group at McMaster to be able to to synthesize the ethical frameworks that do exist, such as the FDA, European bodies, and in Canada. And then do an environmental scan of ACT clinical trial units, so existing trials that have been completed within the last 2 years, looking at protocols, looking at consent forms, looking at inclusion and exclusion criteria, maybe broadening this to all clinical trials that have been in Canada. But the idea would be to be able to access a bit more detailed information and work directly with the CTU leaders. And then to be assessing barriers and facilitators specific to ACT investigators or specific to trialists really in Canada, so that we could adapt and inform tools and processes that would be helpful to the Canadian context. Next slide. So this is our team. So Dr. PJ Devereaux, who is the lead at ACT, was the principal knowledge user. Dr. Annick Berard, who's a pharmacologist at Université de Montréal, is another principal applicant along with me, and others who were helpful and supportive of this initiative are listed here. We are working with Health Canada. We're working with international advisors, with industry, people with lived experience in order to hopefully develop the best approach. Next slide. And these are some names here, and many of whom are CTU investigators who supported this. So thanks to all. So really wanted to now, in the last 20 minutes or so, talk about considerations and opportunities for a lifespan approach to clinical trials together, and really hoping for some engagement from the folks, the participants on this webinar. So some of the considerations that were already mentioned that we'd love to hear your thoughts on are: how should we be thinking about consent and assenting processes for clinical trials in children, in adult trials, in combined trials, and those including pregnancy? Promoting autonomy and informed decisions. What kind of modeling and statistical modeling should we be considering if we are going to be including diverse populations, diverse in age, diverse in lifespan, diverse in terms of culture and ethnicity? So what would be the most appropriate modeling? How can we ensure validated outcome measures that would allow collaboration with international partners? How can we ensure regulatory compliance? What would be the appropriate safety monitoring plan? And then in parallel, how would we be informing the population at large of risks and benefits of clinical trials? So next slide. Again, so with regards to pediatric population specifically, mature minor consent and assenting processes. So how can we incorporate that into trial design? Planning ahead for transitions in care. So I think, referring to when a child reaches consent age, usually that's age 14 or 15, and adulthood at age 18. Mechanisms and funding for long-term developmental follow-up. Again, different modeling approaches, awareness of best practices, age-appropriate recruitment materials, and consideration for age-related variable response. So again, a lot of statistical modeling considerations. Next slide. So we are hoping that in this next part of the webinar that we could really brainstorm together about process for determining acceptable or unacceptable exclusion criteria that the ACT community could really all be on board with. Discuss other educational initiatives like grant writing workshops or training in peer review, international collaborations to learn from other jurisdictions and what would be most helpful for this group. How can we incentivize interdisciplinary teams that includes regulatory expertise, methodologists, pediatric and adult healthcare providers? How can we include experts in pregnancy and child health in your team now? Should it be at the REB level or should it be more centralized? And so we really wanted to discuss what are some opportunities with ACT, again, looking at some of the preg trial initiatives and the impact initiatives, and how can we really come together to understand what are the issues in Canadian trials, what are we doing now, and how can we move forward?
I think it's such a great time to turn it over. Maybe, I don't know if Jean is still here, if there's been any questions submitted, but I think it'd be great to hear from some of those of you who are doing trials. What do you need to help you take that next step in an inclusive approach? Jean, we see your hand.
Sorry, I'm mute. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I am, certainly. Yeah.
And does your trial already include pregnant people or children?
Not really, because I'm unfortunately, I'm in kind of an area where COPD, although it is changing, okay, that's probably the good news. But when I started, it was a primarily male disease, and female were for many of them, not in that age, okay, then, but it is changing, okay? Therefore, this would certainly be applicable nowadays, where 20 years ago when I started, it wasn't, okay? But to your point, I don't think that we were looking so much those days about the lifespan, okay? There was so much to find out about the disease and effective treatment on the disease. But nowadays, it will certainly be it will be different than what it was 20 years ago. Thanks for highlighting that to us. Yeah.
Anyone
So
else
thinking
want-
about, I mean, I know COPD, affects older people, so it doesn't by default really affect children or usually pregnant people. But asthma, for example, does. And how can we conceive of a trial, a trial for asthma that, that would be applicable to pregnancy and pediatrics? And would people think about one trial, about two kind of sister trials, or how would people really conceive of a trial for an asthma therapy?
Natalie, that's you're absolutely right. You will think that, for example, in your own institution, my institution at the Glen, that because we put together in the same building, we put together pediatric and adult, that this thing would happen more easily. But you said it earlier on, it's a change in culture. It's not something that is going to happen by itself. It is something that is going to happen because some people like yourself, okay, are making the effort, okay, to change the mentality. That takes time. And obviously, okay, it's nice to see that the funding body are probably more open, okay, to these type of initiative. But then we have to lead the way also for the industry. Well, one thing that is a concern, and it's a question, a comment and a question to you, is the regulatory body. Okay, because, okay, you've been talking a bit about FDA. I don't know about Health Canada, but maybe our approach have to change also, because the way, okay, that drug, okay, are approved, it is still very much in silo. Therefore, okay, how is that going to change in the future, and how do you see that changing in the future, that it is more representative of the lifespan, okay, because it is not the way that regulatory body are working right now. But again, that may be mistaken. Maybe I don't understand it all, but that would be my comment and my question.
Yeah, so I completely agree. And how our team through PregTrial, how we conceived of this, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts because we're only just getting started. So it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts. But we were thinking that after an environmental scan and really looking at the lay of the land in Canada, that developing standardized tools and processes would be very helpful for researchers, so that they don't have to, be experts at, they are experts at clinical trials already, and maybe have, some knowledge on, these different populations, but that there would be, an approach whereby there's, like, in REDCap, there would be a tick box. Is it appropriate to include or exclude pregnancy? And then there would be a few questions that would be asked that they would have to think about, that would prompt them to think about inclusion or exclusion. There would be some sort of standardized wording for consent involving minors, consent involving people who are pregnant. There would be that additional safeguard of thinking about, teratogenicity, and have there been animal studies and registries. So really kind of, creating tools and processes that would be embedded into the kind of workflow of designing a trial. And the other part that I think we still don't know what the best way to do this is, how to improve our REB's ability to really evaluate these trials in different populations. So should this be at the REB level, which I think would be very challenging? Make sure that there's a pediatrician and an OBGYN in each REB, but then of course you would have to also make sure that there is a, Indigenous health expert, and then it becomes very tricky to get that at every institutional REB? Or should there be more centralized hubs of expertise that trialists in Canada can, or even Health Canada can refer to or consult? So I'm curious what people's thoughts are. Jean, I don't know if you have a particular.
Yeah, it's a new one, Natalie, and I'm just looking at Lorraine, and I was just listening to you and kind of smiling because that was my comment and question. I think one of the first place to start will be the REB. And this would be a fantastic initiative, Lorraine, that Working Can Train and Impact together on this. And it happened recently that I was with someone, a colleague, good friend who is on the REB committee here. They say how much training the REB member would need and they don't have. And while you're talking about this very specific topic of lifespan, okay, research, I think that would be a very good place where we could start working together to CTTP, Can Train and Impact, and building a training for anyone, okay, who start, okay, as a member of a REB. But that's just a kind of a very quick one. I never thought about it that way, but you just make me think about it differently.
Yeah. And I think, Jean, to your point about the REB training, there is a pediatric initiative to harmonize in the pediatric health centers, but there is no reason that group that is already engaged with some of the REB chairs can't expand the discussions to pregnancy and to, trials that involve folks who are lactating. And so I think that's a great point, is that the ethics boards are going to have to get really comfortable in a place where historically they've just been able to say no because it's too, complex or too much risk for institutionally, as opposed to sort of flipping the lens to protecting the person that is pregnant and saying, you're going to take this drug anyways, or there's not a lot of options, and kind of walking them through how to weigh those risks and benefits. As you say, Natalie, there's not standard approaches or tools to help them and to make them feel more confident in their decisions. And so I think that's going to be a huge win for Preg Trial for sure. And Impact and Can Train become the vehicles, right? We become the dissemination and way to reach folks with the new tools for sure. Was there another question?
Martin Ofringa had his hand up. I don't know if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Dayan, fantastic talk, and of course, Lauren. So before I came to Canada, I worked in Europe as a perinatologist and was part of many trials in pregnancy at childbirth. The largest group in Cochrane is pregnancy and childbirth trials, so there's a huge experience around the world. Seems to me that the patients are completely ready and wonder what is the problem. If they have an indication for a treatment, it's either don't use this drug, we know it's bad for you or your baby. Use this drug, we have evidence that it's beneficial and no harm. Or in the middle, we have a trial running and patients want to be in that. So I was just wondering, looking at your slides, where's the patient voice? Before you go to REB and to the TV and to the police, I think talk to your patients and let them do the narrative for us, because they have been so disadvantaged by everybody. And so that is just a thought. Maybe you've thought about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That's very important. And as a clinician, I really do counsel patients on taking this or that drug in pregnancy. And several patients actually are partners in Preg Trial. Not enough though, we really do need big focus groups to be able to understand what, their barriers are. You're absolutely right. And we do plan to embed the patient voice in our approach, but probably should strengthen that even further. Thank you.
I'll give you one barrier, and that's work that still needs to be done. Can we harmonize the acute neonatal and the long-term pediatric follow-up safety outcome measurement tools? So yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's a great point, because, to Natalie's point earlier too, around all these trials may have a handful of pregnant folks or, 10, 20 pregnant folks, and not necessarily powered to really look at efficacy in those populations. And so, Martin, to your point around, if we had a standard set of outcomes that every, you know, pregnancy trial looked at 1 year, at 5 years, at 6 months even, I think that would be really helpful, and that would help with some of that prospective meta-analysis. As we talk about, there are trials happening in Europe and Australia and other parts of the world. And so if we're going to make the best use of all this data, if we can plan ahead and have a standardized set of outcomes for all of them, I think that'd be a really good step forward, and maybe something PRIC trials can take the lead on.
Yeah, I think that would be the gift of Canada to the world, Lauren. I mean, you know, my group here in Toronto has done tons of core outcome sets in child health, but we're really ready to merge and to do this for this kind of intervention trials in pregnancy as well. So I think ACT, if you're listening, or anybody else, you know, I think for $500,000 we can change the world.
Yeah, it's hard to put a price tag on that, but there are core outcome sets that exist. I just put in the international, the ICHOM site, International Core Health. I don't remember what it stands for, but there has been, as you pointed out, really great work on harmonizing pregnancy outcome. I'm not as familiar with the child outcome, but I think through MyCERN and Impact, I think that you've really done a lot of great work on harmonization. But I think it's important that it's not just the fact that these harmonized outcomes exist, are they being used, you know? Are these really the outcomes that independent investigators are using? So I think that it's really kind of not just having these core outcomes out there, but actually ensuring that they're implemented and people know about them.
I wonder too, if as you survey as you survey the landscape in PRIC trial and figure out how all of these trials, if they are including pregnancy, maybe that's one thing that we could also gather data on is, are you using these outcome sets that are available? And if not, why? Is it because it's not the right outcomes? Is it because it's, you know, too many sets of data? Like, I think it'd be really great to gather from a Canadian perspective too, what some of the barriers maybe to implementing these international tools could be once we have a kind of repository of what's out there.
How many of you do kind of multinational studies, or are they mostly single center or Canada-wide? But it would be interesting to know, and is there, through Impact and through the CTTP, is there sort of a push towards this international collaboration, and to have that vision towards the you know, after you have your results, how do you combine them with other groups?
Yeah, and I don't see anyone volunteering, so I can just speak sort of for my trials. So we have a similar trial actually running in Australia, and they run completely separate with a prospective meta-analysis plan. So there's about maybe 6 outcomes that we're both collecting the same way, using the same tools. Obviously, not all of the outcomes are the same. They use different scales for different things. And so I know with our plan has been always that, you know, we would compare our data at the end, because again, running an international trial, we didn't have any money to include international sites. We would have loved to. But the feasibility of that, especially in the different regulatory landscapes, can be really challenging. And the way we work together is that they sit on our steering committee, we sit on their steering committee, they have a member on our DSMB, we have 2 members on their DSMB. And so we really are, as these trials run totally independently, updated and working together the whole time. We were really fortunate to connect actually before both trials launched, so we could do a little bit of harmonization. But that's really what it comes down to, is you have to know what else is going on in the field. You have to reach out to these teams, sometimes blindly, and say, hey, we're investigators over here in Canada. We want to do something similar. Can we meet and learn from you and work together? And I think, you know, that's has been a really good approach for our team. Pediatric community, I will say, you know, they are the most collaborative group. And so it's been a real learning experience, right? Because you also then get to see kind of the barriers that 2 different trials face in different environments. So it's been a really good experience for us.
Great.
I don't see any other questions. So maybe we can just go to just kind of our last slide here, which is just a couple of final points, and then we can let you all get back to your days. And so I think, Given that, pharmaceutical companies aren't likely to step up and address all of the questions that we have about how therapies work and how to optimize therapies in pregnancy and in childhood. And it's really going to be up to a lot of the investigators on this call and the investigators in ACT and all of the trial networks to design trials that are going to answer these questions. And so I think we're in a good place now with the regulatory mechanisms and funding programs and a mandate for a lifespan approach. These are all going to work together to increase clinical trials in the pregnancy space as well as for children. And training is going to be a huge part of this, building capacity. And so as we all move forward together in sort of this changing landscape, Preg Trials and Impact are here to help. So we want that to be very clear. Please feel free to reach out for us if you think about something that we didn't talk about today, or you have a great resource that maybe we didn't mention, you want to share with us. We look at our role in Impact is really to share the work that Preg Trials is doing and that all of your teams are doing in this space. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then Ipsita, I don't know if you had any things that you wanted to add before we sign off.
Actually, so I will put in the chat just a couple of links for our participants. So on our website, you just put this in here for you. There you go. So what I would suggest, and thank you so much for this presentation. I think you covered more than the points that I expected you to cover when it comes to lifespan considerations, both at the investigator level and right up to the systems level and everyone that needs to be involved in all the transformation that needs to occur. So thank you so much for the presentation. What I've put in the chat for our participants is a link to the ACT network. So I think something really important that you've raised is the importance of having trialists with specialty in this area as part of advisory committees, steering committees, et cetera. So please take a look through the ACT networks. We have a number of pediatric and maternal clinical trials research focused networks. So please reach out to those networks. And like, I think what's really important about what you've shared is the importance of collaboration and having people with different areas of expertise that no one trialist or group can take all of it on. So, so please reach out to the trialists, the ACT networks, to start to make those research collaborations. And then the other thing that I've added is just a link to the ACT education page. So as you've mentioned, Impact, CanTrain, and we have a number of other clinical trials training platforms that we work with. So I've just put the link in there so that you can access those training programs, those resources that they're developing. And as Lauren said, if you have resources that you're working on, please connect with these groups so that we can build our library of what's available to the trials community. So thank you again for your talk. I hope that you all got some really important considerations and takeaways, and notes from Jean Bourbeau, who did have to leave a bit early. He wanted to share that this is the beginning of a very important conversation. So I think you've presented to us a lot of really important considerations for all of us to take away and start to integrate into our research practices going forward. So thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and join us for our